since this is the first time we've done this in a while. All right, it's 7 o'clock. Welcome everybody to Wednesday night at the lab. Next week, Lindsay Snyder from the School of Veterinary Medicine will be here. She's going to be talking about what's the point, acupuncture and animals. So if you have pets or if you have livestock or anything like that, anything in between, and you're interested in anesthesia for animals, it's a pretty good thing to tune into because she's going to talk to us about acupuncture in animals. On October 5th, Johanna Oosterwijk is going to be here from horticulture to talk about vertical farming. Yes, we have a horticulturist here who went, yeah, vertical. So most farming is horizontal, and then you control the horizontal, but now you can control the vertical. It's a kind of hydroponic growing. So she's going to run the numbers for us and tell us more about the pros and cons of vertical farming. All right. Now I get to do the more formal part. Welcome everyone to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension Wisconsin 4-H, hence the shirt. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, PBS Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight it's my pleasure to introduce to you Michael Menon. He is with the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology, or the Nelson Institute. The Nelson Institute. And he's also with the Bureau of Aeronautics of the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. He's going to talk with us tonight about the intersection of wildlife and aviation. Michael, I get to ask you the 5 questions. Michael, where were you born?
Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Where'd you go to high school?
Troy High School in Ohio.
Where in Troy, Ohio?
Yep.
Good. And then where'd you go for your undergrad and what did you study?
The University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, and political science, anthropology.
And then you're coming here for your advanced degrees?
Yep.
Very good. And right now you're in your master's program?
Yep.
And
I plan to roll into my doctorate with the same advisor.
Who is David Drake?
David Drake, yep.
And David's given at least 2 talks here. So I'm looking forward to your talk on At the Intersection of Wildlife and Aviation. Would you please join me in welcoming Michael Menon to Wednesday Night at the Lab.
Thanks everybody for coming tonight. I'm going to show some pictures of some animals that I don't think acupuncture will help in my slideshow, so we'll see. Like Tom said, I'm going to be talking about aviation and wildlife, and primarily the conflict that arises sometimes between the two things. And so I kind of have a joint interest in this through what I'm studying and then through what I do at the Bureau of Aeronautics, and that's trying to keep Wisconsin's airports safe and the people that live around the airports safe as well, and the traveling public. So I'll start with an introduction to the problem of aircraft wildlife strikes. And this should be a familiar thing for a lot of you if you've seen the movie Sully and are familiar with that bird strike. But I'm going to play this for you to kind of set the tone for what the problem is and what we're doing about it. So.
Miracle on the Hudson. For the first time, you're about to hear from inside the cockpit of U.S. Airways Flight 1549 as it was going down. The pilot's calmness in the face of possible tragedy is really nothing short of mind-blowing. It's our number 3 story.
Cactus 1539 hit birds to lost thrust on both engines, returning back towards LaGuardia.
Okay, you need to return to LaGuardia. Turn left heading up 220.
220.
Tower, stop your departures. Got emergency returning. It's 1529. He bird strike. He lost all engine. He lost the thrust in the engines. He's returning immediately.
Cactus 1529. Which engines?
He lost thrust in both engines. He said.
Got it.
Cactus 1529. We can get it for you. Do you want to try to land runway 13?
We're unable. We may end up in the Hudson.
All right, Cactus 1549. It's going to be left traffic to runway 31.
31. Unable.
Okay, what do you need to land?
We may end up in the Hudson.
1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549. 1549 Cactus 15.9, runway 4 is available if you want to make left traffic to runway 4.
Idiot. I'm not sure we make any runway. What's over to our right? Anything in New Jersey, maybe Teterboro?
Okay, yeah, off your right side is Teterboro Airport. Do you want to try to go to Teterboro?
Yes.
Teterboro, Empire, actually, LaGuardia departure guy, emergency inbound.
Hey, guys.
Cactus 1529 over the George Washington Bridge wants to go to the airport right now.
Going to our airport. Check. Does he need assistance?
Yes, it was a bird strike. Can I get him in for runway 1?
Runway 1, that's good.
Cactus 1529, turn right 280, you can land runway 1 at Teterboro.
We can't do it.
Okay, which runway would you like at Teterboro?
We're going to be in the Hudson.
I'm sorry, say again, Cactus? Cactus 1549, radar contact is lost. You also got Newark Airport up at 2 o'clock in about 7 miles. Eagle Flight 4718, turn left thing 210.
210, 4718. I don't know, I think he said he was going in the Hudson.
Okay, he's on the Hudson River. He's just about a mile and a half north of the Lincoln Tunnel. Last sighted below 900 feet. We still got a target on him, but it looks like he's low level. You get anybody, you send him right over to the Lincoln Tunnel. We had a Cactus Airbus go down in the water.
Just incredible, amazing.
So that flight and the subsequent media attention that whole scenario got was kind of like the most recent landmark wildlife strike, and that brought a lot of attention from people that didn't normally think about these sort of things, and a lot of sort of reactive action from airports and the FAA and wildlife biologists to try to figure out how to make something like this not happen again. And so I'm going to continue on a little bit about the history here of wildlife strikes. So the very first bird strike was, as you probably could imagine, Orville Wright, and that took place back in September 7th of 1905. You got to see a theme of Septembers in here. That was in Dayton, Ohio, and it's based on a little bit of analysis that was available at the time, likely a red-winged blackbird, which we kind of know very much here in Wisconsin as kind of the bringers of spring around our marshes and wetlands. First mammal strike was in France with Louis Leroux, and that unfortunately was a farm dog that wandered into the propeller, and so that was the first mammal strike. And then the first fatal strike was Cal Rogers in Long Beach, California in 1912, and that was a gull that took that aircraft down. And then another kind of landmark accident that took place was in Elmendorf, Alaska with the U.S. Air Force AWACS aircraft. This was in 95, 27 years tomorrow. And 24 crewmen died on that, and that was Canada geese that took out that aircraft. And so that led to a lot more federal funding looking at stopping these wildlife strikes from happening, and then the formation of a more formal BASH program, which is the military equivalent of what the FAA does at civilian airports. It also fed some funds into the National Wildlife Research Center, which is in Sandusky, Ohio, and I'll mention that again later on in my talk, but this was kind of a thing that got it moving. And it's unfortunate that a lot of times with wildlife strikes that it's a reactive sort of response to something that happens, and something that I'm trying to change here in Wisconsin to be more proactive in what I do at the Bureau. So that's just a little background on kind of where things started with wildlife strikes. Some more numbers, and there's not going to be a test on this, so don't feel like you have to memorize all of these. The data for this is coming from the FAA, and in 1990, the FAA put together or started or rolled out the National Wildlife Strike Database. So that was the first sort of formal data repository where people could submit wildlife strikes. And then we as scientists and as aviation managers can start having actual data to our avail, so we could start making some decisions on how to make these, how to mitigate some of these problems. So 254,980 strikes since 1990. That's through the end of 2021. About $1 billion in damage, and that is grossly underestimated because we don't have very good data from insurance companies. We don't have data from a lot of wildlife strikes where the pilot would just taxi to their hangar and fix it themselves and not report it. And then the ancillary costs from that. So that's damage to the aircraft, but you have to consider downtime for the aircraft if it's an airline, so they're not making revenue off of that. Missed flights for passengers, hotel rooms, food vouchers, things like that, that all get built in if you experience a wildlife strike. 292 human deaths, 327 injuries since 1990. Not included in that 292 is another big event, which was the 1960 Eastern Airlines L-188 Electra. That was the most fatal bird strike to date. And that took place where it crashed right off of Boston Harbor, or into Boston Harbor. That's a picture of it being salvaged from the water there. 62 people died there, and European starlings were the species that caused that. And so from that point, if you think back, we were looking at 1905 all the way to 1990. That's a lot of years to go by without formally collecting data. And this event, and then kind of solidifying the reasoning behind that database, was the Elmendorf incident. So we're starting to get to the point now in the early 90s where, yeah, we need to start looking at this stuff. 271 aircraft destroyed. That's either broken to where it can no longer fly or completely obliterated. And then you've got 273 airports that have reported strikes. So that seems like a lot, but we have about 20,000, we have 20,061 airports as of 2021 in the US. 522 of them have airlines. So I'll differentiate between airline airports and airports that are general aviation. And that's the easiest way to delineate it. So the FAA has a different approach and a different sort of criteria that those airline airports have to abide by compared to being more advisory and more of a best practices way of looking at it at the other airports. That's not to say that there's a safety lapse, but it's just a different set of criteria. In 1990, I think there were about 17,500 airports, so there's a bit of a growth in that as well, but we're looking at about 20,000 airports right now, and 2,073 airports since 1990 have reported strikes. So how does wildlife damage an aircraft? So I have to do a little bit of a conversion here. So an aircraft engine and an airframe, so the rest of the plane that's not the engines, are designed to withstand between 1.1 and 3.6 kilograms. So that's 2.4 to 8 pounds of bird mass. So the engines usually are not built to withstand more than 1.8 kilograms, and that's one bird. So you can imagine that you have one bird going through there. It may, if it's less than that weight, it could still function enough to provide power or lift to the aircraft. What we saw in the US Airways flight at the beginning, they lost both engines. They hit a flock of Canada geese. So multiply that by 1, and if you can see, Canada goose is greater than 3.8 kilograms. So that's a lot of bird mass. And if they're hitting 2, 3, 4 of those, that's lights out for the engines. Other parts of the airplane could withstand a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on where the bird hits it. And then the nose and radome, windshield. So the radome is where the radar sits, the very front of the plane, that kind of rounded part. Windshield is a windshield. Wing and rotor, so rotor for a helicopter or like a gyrocopter that use that for lift. And then an engine are most commonly struck by birds, with the engine being the one that's struck the most. And then as far as terrestrial mammals go, landing gear, critical sensors. So aircraft have things called pitot tubes and other sensors on the sides of the aircraft that tell the pilots what their altitude is, what their airspeed is, and those oftentimes are going to be what gets hit by a terrestrial mammal. And we'll talk about which ones in a little bit later. And the reasoning for that is a change in the design of aircraft. So through the years, aircraft have gotten faster, they've gotten quieter, but they've done that more efficiently with less engines. So if you think back to a 4-engine, radial, big, huge aircraft, that was loud, but it was slow. Birds could hear that and have a little bit more time to get out of the way. But now you're bringing a much faster jet in, which much more efficient, quieter engines, so that bird may not see it, or the flock of birds may not react to it until it's too late, and now you've got engines ingesting birds. And then the other thing to kind of talk about why or how wildlife damages an aircraft is most strikes will take place during takeoff and landing. So that's, if you look at 3,000 feet or lower, that's about the range of where most of the strikes take place. And if you think about that, when an aircraft is taking off, it's going fast, and the pilot does not have time to do evasive maneuvers if they've gotten past that point where the aircraft is starting to lift off. So if it's starting to lift off and there's a flock of birds, they're going straight for the flock of birds. You can't go around it or pull up or go down. If you go down, you're in the ground. If you pull up, you're going to stall. Same way when you're coming into land. You're coming to land, you're changing the configuration of the aircraft. You've got flaps out. You're kind of trying to get that airspeed down so you can put it down on the ground without going too fast. And again, it's hard to maneuver at that point. So those are when strikes occur. That's how wildlife damages aircraft for the most part. Here's my warning about the next few slides. There'll be a little graphic. I didn't go too graphic, but you'll kind of wanted to give you guys an idea of what some of the damage looks like on aircraft. Oops, went a little too quick here. Or there's a lag and there we go. So this is a engine on a brand new Cessna Citation at an airport here in Wisconsin. And this aircraft ingested a sandhill crane. And so that was what came out on the side. Behind the aircraft was strewn about the runway, the rest of the sandhill crane. You could not tell that it was a crane other than the fact that people watched it happen, so they were able to identify the species that way. So this here is a helicopter. This took, I think it was 4 snow geese in Arkansas. So this would be the Ray Dome area here that I was talking about, but then both windshields and the Ray Dome got taken out. Luckily, it was able to land without any fatalities or serious injuries, but the helicopter was pretty much toast, as were the geese. And then this is a turkey vulture that I think this was in the Tennessee area, and that went right through the windshield. So a lot of times it's a singular bird, and a pilot will react, and they can go down, but it's still too late. It goes through the windshield. And so if you imagine you're flying a plane, or if you're sitting in your car and all of a sudden a big bird comes through there, you've got to be very quick to think about that. If you look at the door that's open there, you can see the remnants of that bird up there. And then this one's pretty gross, but it sets the tone for kind of like what can happen. So this is a bald eagle that penetrated the windshield of an aircraft, and you could tell what it is. It was easy to identify the species, but unfortunate for the bird. But the plane did make it down all right. Some more of what could happen in there. So in our field, we refer to the red stuff that you've seen in all the pictures as snarge. So that's your word of the day, is snarge. And I've got a little reminder of that at the end of my presentation. So that snarge is collected if you don't know what it is. So we were able to tell that was a bald eagle pretty easily, but if we weren't able to, if that head wasn't there and if it was just feathers and snarge, that's collected and it's sent off to Washington, D.C., to the Smithsonian, and they have a feather ID lab. And so they use DNA analysis, and they're able to identify to the species level of what was hit, if you've got enough of that. Some interesting things that have come about from that is they've had frog DNA, they've had rabbit DNA on a bird strike that took place at altitude. And that was either stomach contents in some scenarios, but a lot of times what it is that a bird of prey will, when it knows it's got to get out of the way, will drop whatever it has just caught, and the plane will end up hitting the fish or the frog or the rabbit, and the bird will get out of there. And this is why you have rabbit strikes at 2,000 feet. So it's always a surprise of what comes back from there. I mentioned terrestrial mammals, so this is landing gear. So you can see that left main over there. It looks like the red, we call those wheel pants in aviation talk. It's just a covering over the wheel. And that's an elk that unfortunately didn't make it, and the plane was a little bit worse for wear as well. This is a deer at a Wisconsin airport that was hit by the propeller of an aircraft, and obviously the deer didn't make it. The aircraft sustained some damage and was out for a while. So these are kind of the things that can happen, and there's lots and lots of other scenarios, but these are some of the ones that, just to kind of illustrate what goes on. So why are there animals at the airport? Well, they use the airport for 4 main reasons. The first one would be migration and a travel corridor. So the birds don't be like, oh, there's an airport, we need to go around it. The birds are going to fly, where the birds are instinctually flying during migration, in the flyways, and to get to and from where they roost and where they feed. So a bird is going to go where a bird needs to go, and it's not going to be, weary or cognizant of, oh, there's an airport, I should go around it. They also use the airport for food. So grassy areas at the airport, great grazing areas for deer, especially if you don't have a fence around your airport. So they'll come out of the wooded areas or the adjacent fields and come and go to their salad bar at the airport. And then for cover, so again, grassy areas provide great cover areas for species like the badger to burrow in, and we do find big holes there, and so that's something that is just, there's lots and lots of grass, lots and lots of openness, and animals are attracted to that. And so the final one is water. So you've got food, shelter, water, and then just a rite of passage. So 4 reasons why we have animals at airports. Airports are traditionally built kind of on the outskirts of town in low-lying areas, and sort of the, when they were designed and when they were built, kind of the unwanted, you couldn't do anything else there, so let's put an airport there. As you know, watching urban development over the years, that seems to be where things move to, because you run out of land, it encroaches on the airport. So you still have these waterways. You have a lot of impervious surface at an airport, so the water needs to go somewhere. A lot of times there's detention ponds and other areas that get saturated during a rain, and so those stay wet. That's an attractant. So we call these things attractants in what we do. So wildlife attractants includes the water, the food, the shelter. So a few more stats. So far, since 1990, since data is being collected, 620 species of birds, 52 species of terrestrial mammals, 44 species of bats, and 29 species of reptiles have been noted on wildlife strikes. Before I came here to Wisconsin, I was at an airport in Georgia, and we had alligators on our airfield. And so I remember one morning, we had 2 airports that we worked at. My friend who was running the other airport sent me a video of him chasing an alligator that was just meandering down the runway. And so, yeah, it was a big one too. And then the airport I was at, we had a pond, a drainage pond that had baby alligators in it. So it was interesting to see that. Coming from the Midwest down to there, it was something that I was not experienced with having alligators in an airport.
Yeah.
So waterfowl, gulls, and raptors are the most damaging birds to aircraft. And again, that goes back to what I was talking about earlier with how much they weigh and that threshold of design. So they're weighing quite a bit. Remember, the Canada goose was greater than 3.8 kilograms. So you're getting up there. Turkey vulture is about 2 kilograms. So these are big birds. And then deer and coyotes are the most damaging mammals that are hit by aircraft. And populations of these avian species are increasing. And so this is due to protection, environmental initiatives, and land use changes. So this is mainly because all the bird species that are hit are protected either by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act or other state and local legislation. So for instance, in Wisconsin, we've got a lot of birds protected because we're in the Mississippi Flyway, protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, but we also have things like wild turkeys, which are protected by Wisconsin DNR. And so you have, a turkey is a huge mass. I think it's something like 12 kilograms. So if that gets hit, or if you hit a turkey, and a turkey will act in 2 ways. It's sort of like a terrestrial mammal, and if it takes flight, you're hitting it like a bird. So it's kind of like the double whammy there. But Richard Dolbear, who's kind of the most eminent scientist in wildlife damage management at Aviation, his study in 2020 showed that 26 of the 36 avian species that had a body mass greater than 1.1 kilograms, their populations have increased during the time period from 1990 to 2018. And so a case study of that is the bald eagle, which you saw a picture of earlier. So if you look to the left, this is from 1990 to 2018. Their population is hovering just about 200,000 in North America. And the graph on the right is showing the number of strikes over the years. And so we had 44 strikes up and through 2021. So those strikes are 44, seems like, oh, that's not a lot. But when you think about all the other numbers that I've talked about, damage-wise, it is increasing. And that trend line shows that we're getting more and more eagles, which is great for conservation of eagles. But then that's something that biologists and managers have to consider when mitigating wildlife strikes. Another example here, this is also taken from Dr. Dolbeer's study. On the left, you've got single bird strikes. So you've got large birds on the left or on the top, medium birds on the bottom. Those are the weight ranges there. You can see since 1990, the reported strikes have increased. Now, I will say that as the word is getting out that we want people, we want aviators, we want airports to report strikes so that we can get data, that data reporting has increased. So there's part of that increase is because people are reporting, we're getting the word out. But it's still increasing. And the graphs on the right show multiple strikes. So these multiple strikes are the ones that are particularly dangerous. As you saw with the US Airways flight, that was multiple birds that got taken in. And so if you think about, and the Boston Harbor flight, that was a lot of starlings. So one starling, that's fine, maybe. Two, it can handle it. But when you start getting 3, 4, 5, 6 in there, the aggregate of that is the equivalent of one big bird. So those are all upward trending. So things to consider when we're looking at how to manage these. So that's the problem. So now how do we solve that problem? So where do the solutions come from? So managing these are multiple stakeholder approaches. So you have airport personnel. So those are the people on the ground at the airport. So airport managers, airport operations agents. And then you have wildlife biologists. A lot of airports, of the 522 that have airlines, a lot of those airports have wildlife biologists that are stationed there. So a big partner of airports and the FAA is USDA Wildlife Services. So they provide wildlife biologists that are stationed at the airport. So we have here in Dane County, at the Dane County Airport, there is a wildlife biologist stationed there. There's one stationed at General Mitchell in Milwaukee, and he goes over to Timmerman from time to time and does a lot of the airports in southern Wisconsin. And then up north, we have, so there's 2 districts in Wisconsin where we have wildlife service folks, and they take care of, the northern district takes care of the northern airports. They're not stationed up there, but they do go to them quite a bit. So we have that presence here in Wisconsin, but nationwide, there are a lot of wildlife services people at airports. But it's not just wildlife services. There are private companies that provide this service, and then some state DOTs, like we do here in Wisconsin, have people like myself that look at this as well. Municipal governments, their role would be, land use, zoning, and oftentimes governing the discharge of firearms, and we'll come to why that's important later on. But certain ordinances that they have that either help or hinder the ability to mitigate wildlife at airports. Our friends at the federal government, FAA, other agencies, so Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and then really the most, the ones that are really there are the pilots and the airlines themselves, and then the general public. So everything is about keeping the general public safe, either if you're on the aircraft or if you're living around the airport or on the ground en route. So everything we do is to try to keep the general public safe and then work together to find the best solution to things. So what's the first step in management? The first step would be to identify what the problem is on the ground. So that takes place by conducting something called a wildlife hazard assessment or a wildlife site visit, which a wildlife site visit is kind of like a wildlife hazard assessment light, and I'll talk about that here in a second. They're completed by a person that is a qualified airport wildlife biologist. Those qualifications are set forth by the FAA. And there's an educational component and an experiential component to that. So you know that you have someone that is familiar with wildlife ecology, that can and will do the science, but is also trained and familiar with the airport environment. Because it is a unique environment compared to going into a forest. You have to take a few things into consideration. It serves as the basis to develop a wildlife hazard management plan. So you do the assessment, that's your data, and then you develop your plan based on that and how you are going to take care of the problem that's specific to your airport. So a wildlife hazard assessment is required every 10 years or when conditions change at airports with airlines. So we like to see them every 10 years. There's a plus or minus on that by a couple of years, but we like to see it every 10 years. And then if something changes, so if you have a runway project, you extend the runway, you build a terminal, something like that, there needs to be a new WHA. And then also, if there's a wildlife strike, so if all of a sudden something happens and it's like, well, let's look at this again, see why this is going on. So it's a constant push to try and be on top of why things are the way they are and be on top of what's going on at the airport. The wildlife site visit is recommended and advised at general aviation airports. So remember, general aviation, it can have big aircraft. It could have a lot of aircraft coming in and out, but there's not a scheduled airline service there is the most easy way to describe that without getting into the like the criteria that FAA have for that. So if you think about that, so wildlife site visit is a 1 week of the year. You go for about 2 or 3 days and assess the situation there. The problem with that is it's just a snapshot for 1 week. So if I go and do one of these next week, we are at the beginning of fall migration, so my numbers might be a little bit skewed compared to if I go do that in the middle of June, or if I go there and do it in the middle of February when it's 20 below and nothing's moving. So all the animals are like, why are you out there? It's so cold. So that's the two sort of ways that are officially assessed. And the reason for these are they're uniform. All of the biologists who do these know how to do them, and that gives parity to the data. And so it's not just go do one. There are guidelines, and it's guided by the FAA's advisory circulars that lay out how to conduct these. And those advisory circulars also lay out how an airport should manage an attractant. So what can be close to an airport, what can't be close to an airport, the separation distances that we take into consideration. The most restrictive is we look at 5 miles from any part of the airport where an aircraft can operate on. So we're interested in 5-mile radius of the airport. And that's because what we don't want to have happen is we don't want to create an overflight hazard to where a flock of birds is going from an agricultural field and flying over the end of the runway to get to water. And so a plane's taking off, and if that's a problem, that could happen all the way to 5 miles out. And the reason for 5 miles is that's usually where aircraft are arriving and departing, they're starting their descents, they're reaching their climbing altitude. But then also if you're into a bigger airport, a lot of circling goes on there. So if you're coming into the pattern, waiting to land, those of you that have ever flown out of O'Hare or a bigger airport, you know that you're not going to be the first to land or the first to take off. You're going to have to wait a while, and that's where that circling takes place. If the weather's bad and they've got to circle around, or if there's something going on the ground, maybe there was a bird strike and an aircraft is disabled, that's that circling area, that 5-mile radius. So continuing management solutions, so they could be 2 main categories, is non-lethal and lethal. And the non-lethal are habitat modification, harassment, exclusion, and then removal. So you're trapping them and relocating them. Lethal ways are going to be trap and euthanize, shooting, or using toxicants. And I'll get a little bit more in detail on those. So habitat modification. So this is simple as mowing grassy areas. So different species like different heights of grass, depending on what you have that you found in your wildlife hazard assessment, you would adjust the grass height to keep certain species away from being there. So a foraging goose is not going to come into tall grass, but you're going to be getting in some certain passerine birds, songbirds, that like that. So you weigh which one is going to be the most hazardous to aviation. And so in that scenario, you probably, if something's not going to be huge flocks, they're not going to be as detrimental, that's where you would keep your grass height at. Grading land to remove standing water. This is a big one in a lot of areas because municipalities and DNRs across the country want you to have water filtration so that the water stands for a long period of time and it filters through, and that's part of the hydrologic cycle. But we in aviation want water to be standing for no more than 48 hours. So if it's a big rain, you've got a detention pond, 48 hours and it's gone. Otherwise, you start creating a pond and a wetland, and that's attracting wildlife. Removing agriculture crops. So smaller airports, one of the pushes and what the FAA wants to see is airports to be as self-reliant as possible. So one of the ways to do that, other than landing fees and selling fuel and having other amenities charged, so if there's a restaurant, there might be a cut that the airport gets, but one way to do that is to lease land to farmers and they get money from having crops. So it's easy to kind of cheat that, and you get crops closer and closer to the runway surfaces or the taxiway surfaces. We want to see those agriculture crops removed because they are an attractant. And then removing trees and snags, places where raptors can perch on. So if you have that adjacent to a grassy field, that's a perfect spot for a hawk or eagle to sit and wait until it sees something. And so that's kind of habitat modification. Exclusion, fencing. So the fence has to be a good fence. It can't be just down to the ground barely and be able to shimmy underneath it. We like to see fences that are 8 to 10 feet tall with a barbed wire top to it. We like to see them buried under the ground, and so that an animal can't dig its way under. Netting, so bird netting is something that you put around stuff just to kind of exclude birds from nesting in there. Spiking, so that sign that you saw at the beginning with the snowy owl sitting on it, if those had spikes on it, the tops of the signs would have spikes, so that would deter a bird from perching on it. So that's what spiking is. And this is a picture of these bird exclusion balls that are on this body of water. So those of you who have been to Chuck E. Cheese or a ball pit kind of can imagine that. They're just plastic balls that float on the water, so that keeps waterfowl from landing in there and using that as somewhere to go. So they look at that and it's not amenable to what they need to do, so they bypass it. So a lot of municipal sewage areas use these to also keep the smell down, but they're a great application at airports to keep things. Another way of keeping birds off of water is through a wire grid. So you'll put a wire grid with maybe some streamers on it to exclude birds from landing in that water. So that's exclusion. And then harassment. So the most fun way to harass birds is through pyrotechnics. So these are non-lethal, remember. You use a starter pistol, kind of like in track and field. It's got a propellant and a little cap. It'll light this bird banger. That bird banger will fly away for a little bit and then it will explode. The university did not want me to bring one to show you tonight, so unfortunately I couldn't do that. There's also whistlers. They'll come out right away and they'll start making this whistling sound and it'll scare. Those are primarily used for like coyotes and fox to get them to kind of go, and deer don't like those. But the bird banger is pretty effective to disperse a flock of birds. They'll come back eventually, but if you need them out of the way right then and there, this is a good way to do that. Using dogs and raptors. So you saw a picture a few slides ago of 2 dogs. Those are working dogs that will be at the airport. They'll be owned by either maybe Wildlife Services or the biologist there, or by the airport itself. And that dog will go out and it'll chase flocks of birds away. So the birds will see that dog as a predator and they'll say, hey, this isn't a safe place for us to hang out. Let's not go there. The dog is under control of its handler, so it's not going to pose a threat to the aircraft. And then effigies. So airports will use, those of you that have been to like Home Depot or Lowe's, you see the owls, the little plastic owls. Well, those get used at airports. Fake plastic coyotes. So kind of like birds will see that and they'll be like, well, there's a predator. We don't want to come here. Those are effective if they're moved around, but at some point, animals are smart. They're going to be like, that's not going to do anything to me. It's plastic. It's going to get habituated to that. So you've got to be kind of diligent with how you use those effigies, change things up, and keep the animals surprised. And then sound and noise, so the bird banger, the whistler that I talked about. But there are things like propane cannons. So it's a cannon that will shoot a big noise, and you can time that to go off intermittently. And a lot of airports have that. Hartsfield, Jackson, Atlanta Airport has a very robust propane cannon system down there. And it's all controlled remotely, and they can kind of set it off to, whenever it needs to go off to disperse birds as needed. And there's other sound and noise, so things like the used car, the little thing that goes like that, we use those as well. It comes out with a noise, it has some flashy lights, things to scare animals away, to get them to not want to be in a certain area. So now the lethal. So it's the last means that we want to use at an airport, and it's not just haphazard. It's regulated by federal and state permits. A lot of airports will use hunting seasons to help augment their other mitigation efforts. So that's a great way to have a regulated and safe deer control or turkey control, pheasant control at your airport. Authorized personnel, so you have to have permission to be on the airport. You have to go through a training so you understand what you're doing out there. And the efforts or the methods are humane. So it's not just, let's round them up and do this to them. They're all humane methods of controlling the animal. The permit part is either authorized by U.S. Fish and Wildlife or your local state DNR, depending on what species it is. So this is not something that's just, let's go kill them right away. It's let's try everything else first, and only if it's the last resort are the lethal methods taken. So for the most part, it's a combined solution. So we look for an integrated approach using several of these methods to try to make the airport a safer environment. But most often, that key is habitat modification as the first way. And a lot of times that is the way that works. If you take away the attractant, take away the food, take away the cover, exclude them from accessing it, that works. The animal moves on, and then you have a period where you don't have a problem anymore. You can't get complacent. Something will find a way in, something else will move in. You have to always be on your feet, but habitat modification is the best course of action. So some new approaches that are coming out of the National Wildlife Research Center, that's in Sandusky, Ohio, from other graduate students like myself that are studying this, other labs across the world, and then private sector innovation as well. So lighting on aircraft. So birds have a different spectrum of vision than we do. So there's some research going on right now into changing the wavelength and the coloration of lights on aircraft so that birds will see them sooner. So when airplanes are flying, they have landing lights that they can turn on. When birds see that, because remember, landing and takeoff is when you're most susceptible to these. So if a bird can see the light sooner, they might go away soon, or like disperse sooner. And then that would help, because remember, the planes are getting softer and faster. If they can see that sooner, you might mitigate some strikes that way. Bioactive ground covers. So this is treating grasses with, so there's an endophyte infected ground fescue that Milwaukee Airport actually did some test plots on, and it's working there to keep geese from grazing on that. There's also companies that you could treat crops for to keep cranes and other birds from eating the crops. There's research now into looking at applying that on an airport setting. So can airports apply this to grasses and other types of ground cover to keep animals from wanting to graze on that? The use of unmanned aerial vehicles, which we commonly know as drones. That's a drone, so he's holding a remote control Raptor, which will go around and fly and chase away birds, and so the birds see that as more of a threat than maybe an effigy or a bird banger. So this is something that's moving, it's unpredictable because he can control it. So there's getting a lot of research on that. But then just drones in general, so looking at drones that can fly a certain pattern at an airfield before an airplane lands or before an airplane takes off. So if there's a scheduled flight and you're at an airport that has a lot of wildlife, maybe you don't have a lot of staff, you can program this drone to go out and fly and chase away any birds or any animals that might be on the field, and then that plane can come in or take off safely. And then you have, like I said, a lot of this emanates from the think tank of the National Wildlife Research Center in Sandusky. And then also at the Bird ID Lab, they're getting better and better of taking minuscule amounts of DNA and being able to identify to the species level what particularly hit the aircraft or what the aircraft hit, so that we can make better decisions on that was this animal or that was this that group of animals that hit the airplane. So you have to excuse me, I spent yesterday afternoon in the botany greenhouse and all the plants are getting to me allergy-wise. So, all right, so a little bit about what I'm researching for my master's research. I'm looking at land use change over time, so looking at how the 5-mile radius around an airport has changed from 1990 to 2020, and then do we see changes in what animals are struck or what the composition of species that are being struck are at these airports. I have 8 airports, so these are the 8 airports that we have in Wisconsin that have airline passengers. Dane County, Appleton, La Crosse, Green Bay, Eau Claire, Rhinelander, General Mitchell in Milwaukee, and then Seaway up in Mosinee. They all fall under that 522. We have one other one, Janesville falls under that as well, but they don't have scheduled airline service, so I'm not using them because there's not a lot of robust data right now. So using U.S. Geological Survey land use data, FAA wildlife strike data, and then FAA aircraft data to try to paint a picture and say, over time, as we've either urbanized or we've taken forest land and converted it to this, whatever the change may be, has there been a reactive change in the composition and strike patterns that we see at airports? So that's what I'm working on now. And then proposed research for my doctorate would be to look at that gap in data. So there's a lot of robust data from the 522 airports in the nation on wildlife strikes. And that's because airports are reporting them. The FAA is mandating that report. They're not mandated, it's not compulsory. It's still a voluntary basis, but most airports are reporting them. Airlines have policies in place that if they hit something, it will get reported. So Delta, American, United, they all have policies that their pilots will report any wildlife strikes. And then pilots themselves are busier airports, so you're getting more data from these sources. But general aviation airports, a lot of times there is the stigma of if you report a wildlife strike that something bad is going to happen to you, that the FAA is going to be angry at you for having that. And that is not the case at all. We want you to report them because we want to be able to have that data so that we can help airports and help municipalities make informed decisions on how to manage the airport, how to modify the habitat. And we can bring resources to help do that. And so I'm looking at, in Wisconsin, at 9 airports, what's going on the ground. So what animals are using the airport, what is the land cover like, what cultural mitigation effects are going on, do they have a fence, are they using harassment, do they have permits to shoot and lethally take animals. So I'm collecting that baseline data, and then I'm going to kind of build a model based on all of the inputs so that an airport can have a tool that they can say, all right, well, we have this, and this criteria. Our risk to having a wildlife strike is this quantified value. If we change these things, that risk goes down. That's going to help them make decisions on land uses in and around the airport. Or if they say, well, we're going to cut the agriculture down, that's going to increase or decrease our probability, so we want to do that. So that's the next phase of research. So, and then finally, like I promised, remind you of the word snarge. So if you don't remember anything I talked about, remember the word snarge. And again, that's the residue of birds that have struck or been struck by aircraft. It's the ragu, if you will, of wildlife strikes. And that was coined by staff at the Smithsonian Bird ID Lab. And so that's what I have for you guys today. So I guess at this point, it's the Q&A time. So any questions?
when I was younger, I became aware of the problem in school where we were told the example of the booty birds on Midway Island. Oh, thank you. Yeah, in school when I was much younger, we learned about the classic example of this problem, which was on Midway Island with the Goonie birds. I was wondering to what extent have they been able to successfully mitigate the bird problem there? And then I was also going to ask you, where in Georgia were you having problems with alligators at airports? I would presume that would just be in the coastal areas of the state. Thanks.
Yep, so the easy answer would be it was Brunswick, Georgia. So yep, definitely the coastal area, so Glenn County. As far as birds on some of the like Midway and Marshall Islands, some of the atolls out there, I actually, at my airport wildlife training that the state director here of Wildlife Services was so gracious to let me go on, I met a girl that works out at Midway Atoll, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with the bird wisdom. So wisdom is the oldest bird known that's alive right now, and she's, I think, 77 years old right now and actively nests on Midway Atoll. The response there was they do the best they can because you have two opposing thoughts, right? You have trying to conserve a bird colony, but you have trying to bring aircraft in and out. And that those Pacific atolls perform an important goal or important function of, that's a lot of times the last refuge where a plane experiencing trouble can land. You're in the middle of the ocean and that's where they go. And so it's a balance. A bigger threat that they're facing there is plastic pollution coming in from the mid-ocean gyre there of plastic. So it's a battle that they're facing there. On one hand, they're trying to do it, but they've got it to where they can kind of harass the birds out of the way in enough time to bring a plane in if they need to, but it's kind of a mix and match. And she was there to learn more about the mitigation aspect of it. So there is a collaboration there. Any other questions?
Out at the Dane County Airport off of CV this summer, they removed a lot of the tree lines. Was that wildlife mitigation, do you know?
So there's active projects going on out there right now of extending taxiways and runways. There's also a next-gen project going on to help with approach distances. So if you think of an airport, you have to think about their air surfaces as an upside-down wedding cake, if you will. And so when an airplane is coming in, the approach that when that airplane can approach the airport, how long it has to land, how long it has to take off is dictated by the obstructions around it. A lot of times, so trees are dynamic, right? They'll grow. So it might not be a problem today, but 10 years from now, it might be a problem. So a lot of that is obstruction mitigation. So it may be a combination of either clearing for a project or next-gen clearing for obstructions or for approach heights. And at times, it could be wildlife. But a lot of times, they get the trees when they're a lot younger. So you wouldn't even, it'd be a sapling or seedling.
You mean if it's wildlife, they would take them a lot?
Yeah, you would know that, hey, that's going to be a problem. Let's get it out now before it becomes a problem.
At certain times in the summer, we get mayfly hatchings over the bridges on the Mississippi. Has that ever been an issue at airports, having mayflies or something similar where you just have?
So having spent a few years working at the Dubuque Airport in Dubuque, Iowa, which is, again, on the Mississippi.
Snowplow Central.
Yeah, we never saw a problem with mayflies there. I think it would have to be kind of an isolated right there and have a burst of that where it could be problematic. We do see where after rains, earthworms on runways will attract large flocks of seagulls. And down south, when you're mowing, kicking up all the insects, you'll get cattle herons or cattle egrets, that would come behind the mowing. And so insects will attract, but I have not seen the mayfly problem or read about that yet. Not to say that it couldn't be a problem, but.
And an airport like National, if I remember right, National Airport in Washington is right above the Potomac.
Yeah.
Is there anything special risks with something like that?
Yeah, a lot of the kind of the northeastern airports that are right along wetlands and right off of runways
So it'd be like Logan?
Yeah, they have a constant battle with trying to keep, and they have a team. So Chicago has like 3 or 4 biologists. They have a team of biologists there that are out doing that, and airport personnel as well. So here in Dane County, there's a dedicated staffer that he does wildlife for Dane County, in addition to having that wildlife biologist that's stationed there from USDA. So a lot of airports have a team of people that do that. But yeah, anytime you're near water, you're increasing that load factor of things that you have to consider for mitigation.
And then anything particular for really high level, high altitude like Quito, 10,000, 7,000 feet, anything like that?
I mean, as far as like the aircraft or the airfield?
For any wildlife implications for, we went from sea level or water level stuff to really high. Is there anything at really high airports?
Nothing that I know that's too different. Wisconsin being flatter than that area. I haven't run into that, especially coastal Georgia being very flat. Haven't run into that yet. But I know that at the higher altitudes there are grizzly bear strikes, there are moose strikes. You get some of those migrating caribou, things like that. But you manage it just like you would any terrestrial mammal at an airport.
Tell us more about mowing heights and which heights control or interfere with the airport being inviting to various animals.
So this is a multifaceted, complicated answer, and I was hoping to not get that one, but you got it. Sorry. And I'll do the best that I can, but the taller the grass, you have a dense, think about it as a mini forest, right? And certain species are not going to want to navigate that, so they're not going to come in there. So Canada geese are not going to land on tall grass. Shorter grass that they can get in there, eat, that's going to be what they like. So the range is usually between 3 to 6 inches is where it's advised to keep your grass, depending on what you have there. Smaller birds, kind of like your meadowlarks or your red-winged blackbirds, I know that I said that caused Orville's crash in 1905, but they're going to be okay in smaller numbers, and they're going to stick to that. They're not going to be hanging out on the runways and things like that. So it's really up to what you have there locally, and it's just based on that wildlife hazard assessment, what's there. But generally, grass is kept around that 3 to 6 inch range, tall enough that the geese don't like to be there, but not too tall where you're providing cover for other species, mammals and things like that to be in there and or nest in there. So yeah, it's a function really of what do you have around there. Sometimes it might be okay to have taller grass, but sometimes you don't want that. You want as short as you can get. And so again, it's just geography has a lot to play in it. I know that's not the greatest answer, but hopefully.
We have a question on Zoom. What sort of risks/stats do you see for military aircraft?
So military aircraft a lot of them are moving a lot faster, but they're really loud. And so you see the exact same threats to what you do at a civilian airport, just with a lot more concentration on keeping flocks of birds away from these multi-million-dollar defense tools. So again, the BASH program at military installations, they have dedicated staff that are out there all the time trying to keep the airport safe. So they have that advantage of having that full-time staff to do that. So it's a lot like a commercial aircraft or commercial airport for airlines. As far as increased risk, just faster aircraft, so they have to be aware of getting them out of there. One thing I didn't mention that I wanted to was that the Cornell Ornithology Lab out of Cornell in New York, they have a bird cast, so a migration cast system, which looks at using weather data where you can actually see migration taking place. So if you go home, Google that, the bird radar, because migration is going on right now, you could look at these migration maps and see actual forecasts of flocks of birds and when they're going to be traveling. And there's bird radar too that they use. So they have radar installations that come out to airports, and you can use that to look at the amount of birds that are there. They are used at military installations quite a bit. So they have that. Again, it's expensive too. So the Department of Defense has those assets. They're able to use those things a little bit more readily than a private airport does.
Thanks. Okay, my first question is purely speculative, but do you think that if passenger pigeons were still around, would they be an extremely serious problem for aircraft? And then also, I was wondering if you could go into a little more detail about the specific colors of lights that are being experimented with as far as keeping birds away. Thanks.
So I would say yes, I think passenger pigeons would create a hazard in that the flocks of them were massive.
Right.
But also knowing that how massive they are and seeing almost where the sun is blocked out from what I've read about how they were, you would know not to fly during that time. And so I think it would be, yes, they're a problem, but maybe a little bit easy to mitigate with them coming in and moving as a whole, not as dispersed. All I can tell you about light is blue seems to be the light that birds will react to the most. So anything in the blue light wavelengths is what they have found is to be the most effective. So I would imagine maybe your purples and blues, those hues in there are more effective.
You had mentioned how they sometimes spray crops to deter birds.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you knew if that had any other environmental impacts on the area.
Yeah, and that's what they're trying to figure out right now. The ones that they're using on crops have been tested, FDA approved through, and then the EPA process of dispersing chemicals. It's the same safe chemical that will kind of dilute with water and not be long-term, so nothing that's going to get into the groundwater. But I'm not as schooled on the actual chemistry of how that works.
One last question. Can you give us an idea of your glide path? How far along you are in your research? How many more years you might have to go? What's ahead for you?
This is probably David that's asking this question through Zoom. Thanks, David. I will be done with my master's in May, if everything goes well, and then I'll roll into the doctorate. And I've already started some of that process, so maybe 4 years or so after that. So
That's impressive. I appreciate that. Any other questions? If not, thank you very much.
Thanks again.